Hello, today I'll be talking to Professor Joseph Margulies, who is a professor of law and government at Cornell University. Professor Margulies is an attorney who loves to constantly learn more about the American criminal justice system's cruelty and inequality, and researches how to maintain healthy, vibrant, and safe neighborhoods. He has written various articles and books such as Thanks for Everything, Now Get Out. I'm so excited to get some insights from you, Professor. So I would like to begin by asking you, what was your inspiration to become an expert in law and also in neighborhoods well-being and gentrification? Perhaps you have a personal connection to the subject matter.
Oh, that's interesting. So you'll think I'm quibbling, and I don't mean to quibble, but I never ever describe myself as an expert. I just describe myself as a student, because I'm constantly learning, and I'm always learning from the folks who are affected, the folks who are on the ground, whether that's in the criminal justice space or the spaces that I've occupied in my professional career, the post 9/11 space or the sort of neighborhood well-being space. And in fact, I came to my most recent book on neighborhood well-being in this neighborhood in Providence, and whether the things that we do to try to prevent neighborhood decline or to restore or distress neighborhoods, whether they end up being counterproductive. Because I went to Providence to study policing, it was part of my criminal justice interest. The Providence Police Department had changed a lot over the first 15 years of this century, and so I was studying that change. But that led me to a deeper inquiry into all the factors that go into a healthy neighborhood. It's not just policing; it's schools, and it's food, and it's transportation, and it's et cetera. It's all connected. It's green space, et cetera. So I came to it indirectly through criminal justice.
Mm-hmm. So that really perfectly leads me into my next question. I was wondering why you chose the place Olneyville in Providence,
Yeah.
rather than such a large city such as New York or Boston. And I was wondering whether this is telling of how gentrification affects even smaller neighborhoods and how we can relate that to larger communities.
Yeah. Well, for one reason, New York is really a well-studied beast.
Mm-hmm.
For another reason, there are so many neighborhoods in New York where gentrification has progressed so far that it's an accomplished fact, and it's very difficult to imagine that these neighborhoods will ever be a place for folks of modest means or for the poor. Certainly not in my lifetime, and probably not in yours, right? You think about places like Soho. That place has changed. Mm-hmm. Brooklyn now is going through a second wave of has been going through a second wave of gentrification of super gentrifiers, right? And so you have multimillionaires and billionaires moving in, displacing the rich gentrifiers with the super rich gentrifiers. So the phenomenon is different there. Whereas in Olneyville, it really is on the cusp of this transformation. And it's still possible to prevent it if they do something new. If they do, business as usual, it hasn't worked anywhere else. It's not going to work there either. And so there was a kind of urgency to studying it as it's happening. It's also, just from a researcher's perspective, it's easy because the neighborhood is also almost exactly the same size as the census tract. So you can track changes in time over the neighborhood by changes in the census tract. So it's really easy sort of to map at a pretty granular level what's going on over time in the neighborhood, and that's really useful.
Going off script a little bit, I think it's interesting that you mentioned how
it's always better to go off script. It's always better.
Yeah, I'm just wondering, so would you say that there are perhaps neighborhoods that are too far gone in terms of gentrification? It's a process that we can't halt
Sure.
anymore?
Absolutely. I mean, there's nothing to halt. It's done. I mean, people of modest means, working class folks, they just can't live there anymore. And that's the case for huge swaths of Manhattan, huge swaths of Boston. And in some municipalities like LA, for instance, the municipality is complicit in that, right? So the way that the municipality has in Los Angeles, the way the city corralled the unhoused population and moved it out of areas that are high visibility to tourists and a business sector, which generates a lot of revenue in LA, and moved it into Skid Row, you know, the sort of the small little 16 square blocks or whatever it is of Skid Row there, right, is part of the illicit relationship between capital and municipal policy that facilitates the gentrification and displacement. And there are plenty of places where it's an accomplished fact. There are plenty of places in Manhattan where it's undergoing, right? There are parts of Harlem that are just on the edge, right? The increasing, you know, it's just sweeping up from the south. So it proceeds at a different pace in different parts of the city.
It would be interesting to figure out at what point it becomes too far gone.
You notice it as really far gone. These, you know, Williamsburg, for instance, once you notice it, it's already far gone, because during that, it's the period before that the property all got into private hands and was in developers' hands, waiting for this opportunity to change, and looking for, you know, municipal financial support or tax incentives to create condos or, you know, higher priced apartments in land that is still cheap. Once the land is no longer cheap, it's already happened, right? So once Williamsburg is visible to you as Williamsburg, oh, wow, look at this great place for brunch. Look at that cool gallery. It's been a done deal for about 15, 20 years by that time. You know, you got to go behind the scenes, and you may not see a visible effect of it. It may still, on the surface, look like a vacant lot, but that vacant lot may suddenly be worth millions and millions of dollars. That's when it's happening.
The efforts should really be focused on prevention rather than.
Absolutely. Absolutely. That's why you got to find these neighborhoods where it hasn't happened yet. You find these neighborhoods where, to appearances, it looks like a disastrous neighborhood. No. That's what you got to get out of your head. That, first of all, the likelihood is that neighborhood is filled with smart, active, vibrant, activist folks who want their neighborhood to be safe, healthy, not a food desert, good school. I mean, they want everything that you and I want, right? And what they don't want is to change the neighborhood just enough for them to get kicked out, right? That's the moral obscenity at the core of my book, right? That we go through this labor that may take decades, and we live through, you know, the times when there's grotesque over-policing and the violence of the crack epidemic and the disinvestment of the economic downturn of the 70s and so on, right? So this neighborhood we live in has been for shit. And now that we finally got it into something where, look, the streets are better, the street lights are lit. They took that vacant lot, that place where the textile plant burned down, and they converted it into this beautiful park. Oh, now we get kicked out. That's got to be morally wrong. That's the essence of the title. Oh, thanks for everything. Now get the hell out of here. That's the book.
I see that. So it's almost like, thank you to the indigenous community for making this a better place. Now it's your time to leave and let us live here.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. Close the door on your way out. I mean, that just can't be. That just can't be. That's if there is a moral obscenity in this world, that's the moral obscenity.
So just to clarify, after World War II, Olneyville booming textile industry collapsed and it became an extremely distressed neighborhood. And you
Yeah.
mentioned how it was trying to better itself. Are there any specific things that were done by the indigenous population to try to better it? And is there a common trend that you have found and strategies that can be applied to revitalize a neighborhood?
I mean, what was done to revitalize Olneyville is to follow a playbook that has worked in other locations. So we know how to do it. The fact is, we know how to repair these badly traumatized, damaged, torn up neighborhoods, right? So it's a matter of reclaiming green space. It's a matter of reforming the police so that they are working collaboratively with the neighborhood. It's a matter of invigorating community groups. It's a matter of bringing in jobs that work for that neighborhood. It's a matter of doing training programs and education for the folks who live in the neighborhood. It's very much the matter of creating genuinely affordable housing that is sustainably affordable, right? And it's a matter of doing this all at the same time, collectively, right? So you can't have silos. So it can be done. It's not easy. It's hard. It frequently doesn't work because the funding isn't there, or groups are fighting with each other for funding, or there isn't enough municipal support, or for a variety of reasons. Sometimes it doesn't. In Olneyville, it worked, and people of goodwill really helped transform this neighborhood and brought it into and made it really a very desirable place. The problem is the existing tools and the existing approach that we have for this transformation isn't sustainable. It doesn't empower the right people in a way that creates sustainable change. We can change neighborhoods, and we've changed neighborhoods all over the country, and then they are vulnerable. That's the problem. It's not that we don't know how to change them. It's that we don't know how to sustain them once they're changed. We don't know how to protect them once they're changed.
So would you say that there are certain practices that perhaps activists or nonprofit organizations or charities that ended up being specifically harmful to it?
It's not that they certainly weren't deliberately harmful. Nobody was acting deliberately. They are very mindful of the risk that I'm describing. The problem is what, in my estimation, have distilled the problem into really two things. One is that the existing approach, which brings resources in and gives it to a constellation of nonprofits and community groups there, and that builds a very small smattering of so-called affordable housing, but is not really affordable to the most vulnerable people in the population. The problem with that model is that it empowers the wrong people and it doesn't decommodify enough property. So what do I mean by that? It empowers the leadership of this nonprofit world, the leadership and the staff and the board and so on. And in many places, this is an old complaint, I'm not the first to make this, that leadership, that employment slice is white, professional class. It's not drawn from the neighborhood. It empowers a group of people who view themselves as shepherds. Overseers is too strong, is not fair. I don't want to make it sound too colonial, but they're outsiders. And as one community activist in Olneyville said to me, they go home at night. They go back to their neighborhoods. They go back to the east side of Providence at night. We stay here. We live here. Those are the folks who should be empowered. So that's the first problem. It empowers the wrong people. And there's a huge talent pool a pool of talented, passionate people who are overlooked because they don't speak the same way and they don't have the same degrees and they don't have the same, they didn't go to school with the guy who's now the mayor's chief of staff, and they don't have the personal relationship with the foundation that funds them, all the things that we know about social capital. And in a place like Olneyville, which has a very high immigrant population, some of them might be undocumented, so they're nervous about being very public facing, but that doesn't mean they're not really, really good. So it empowers the wrong people, and B, we don't decommodify enough property. And by that, I mean, you just gotta make it so that capital can't swoop in and buy it. Because when capital starts doing that, capital has one goal in mind, and that is to get bigger. And that is capital's reason for being. It wants to go to a place where it starts small and then grow, and then sell and pocket that money. Its interest is not in creating stable space, enduring, affordable space for neighborhood residents. That's not its job. So those are the two pieces. You got to empower the right folks, and you got to decommodify a heck of a lot more property.
Referring back to the empowerment that you mentioned, would you say that should be targeted towards perhaps education, or would you say it's more business economics?
Of course, the answer is all of the above, right? But what I have in mind is there is a fair amount of money that flows into these neighborhoods.
Yes.
Not enough, but a fair amount of money from a variety of sources. That money should go to the neighborhood rather than to the nonprofits that work on behalf of the neighborhood. The model I have is what I call a neighborhood trust, that all the resources that flow into the neighborhood from all the neighborhood's assets that come in should be held in trust for the benefit of neighborhood residents, and particularly low-income neighborhood residents, right? So that the trustees have a legal obligation to act on behalf not of a board of a nonprofit and not of a foundation, but on behalf of neighborhood residents. They own the trust. That's what I mean.
Yeah, I feel like traditionally people associate the private sector as being responsible for creating the flawed system that leads to the destruction of neighborhoods. So in your opinion, would you say that there is a role that the government should be playing in terms of preventing that from happening and protecting the population that lives in towns such as Olneyville?
Sure. The government's already involved in helping to destroy these neighborhoods, right? Government policy about housing and government policy about creating opportunity zones and things like that. Well, that incentivizes capital to go in certain places where it's unrestricted. So the government's already complicit in, and has been for decades, in creating places like Olneyville. A place like Olneyville doesn't just happen magically, like, oh, someone waved a wand and look, a place that used to be viable now isn't. No. This is a result of policies, right? Policies about redlining, policies about affordable loans that go to one group of people and not others, right? Capital that moves from industry in the Northeast to industry in the South, and then eventually, this is what happened to the textile trade, industry overseas, and so on. So government, it seems to me, has a moral obligation to undo the damage that it's done, right? I mean, it was government policy that created Olneyville as this isolated pocket. The first highway built in Rhode Island, when they were building highways in the 50s, was deliberately intended to allow drivers to avoid Olneyville, right? It was called when they were coming in from the suburbs, so they wouldn't have to see this place that was becoming a mess, right? And it was called the Olneyville bypass. That's literally what it was called. The first freeway built in Providence was called the Olneyville bypass. Well, you know, when you create an Olneyville bypass, what do you think? You're bypassing people, right? First of all, they ripped up scores and scores of houses and businesses and displaced folks and destroyed their homes. That's what happens with highway construction all over. And then you create this. I mean, the Olneyville bypass is now the southern border of Olneyville, right? It didn't used to be, but it was after we built that, right? So government policy helps create it. It's not the only factor, but it helps create it. So of course, government has a role in facilitating the restoration.
So switching gears a little bit, we are extremely focused on Washington Heights, and from what you mentioned about how you can tell whether a neighborhood is too far gone, I feel like there's definitely things that can still be done to prevent intense gentrification of Washington Heights. And I think that a lot of the gentrifying factors that occur in Washington Heights are supposed to be considered to be protecting them or improving the neighborhood. So I'm just wondering whether there is some balance that can be reached between transforming a place and making it better and making it safer while still protecting it.
Yeah, okay. That's the $64,000 question, right? I've never met anybody who says, where do I want to live? I want to live in an area where there's a lot of crime. That's where I want to live. And you know what? Not only that, I want my kids to go to school there. I want them to get up in the morning and walk, but that's what I want. So, you know, everybody wants the transformation, nearly everybody, the transformation to take place. Everybody has the same ambition to live in an exciting, viable place where there's cultural entertainment and opportunities for physical activity, and diverse shopping, culturally appropriate shopping, et cetera. Okay, fine. So we all want to create that. But in creating that, you don't want to make an area so irresistible that it's subject to gentrification. So there's only one way to do that, and that is to make the land inaccessible to capital. You got to take it out of the speculative market so that people can't come in and say, well, you know, this is really a beautiful, you know what? I'm going to buy up that bodega and replace it with a tapas bar, or I could just, you know, everything's suddenly going to be 16 times higher, more expensive, but man, oh man, I'm going to make me some money. If they can't buy the space, if that space is owned by the neighborhood, then they can't do it. Or if they do it, you can put in a tapas bar, but they can't be there for 5 years while land values skyrocket and then sell it to somebody else who's going to bring in a Michelin-starred restaurant. And then the shift is, as I say, by that time, it's the price of land is so high that you can't prevent the displacement.
I feel like it's such an ironic cycle how on one hand, everyone obviously wants their neighborhood to be better, to be safer, to be everything that you mentioned, but then with it, they're also losing access.
They're vulnerable. That's the moral obscenity. That's the book. That is exactly the book. And in fact, there are actually stories of neighborhoods. Look, it's not like nobody's noticed this before. There are neighborhoods that have said, you know what? We don't want you to clean up that toxic waste dump. Because if you do, I know in 18 months, I want to be kicked out of my apartment. So leave that toxic waste dump there. I'll just keep my kids out of it. Well, okay, that's not okay. In the wealthiest country that the world has ever known, that's not okay. And if that's the world we live in, then we live in a morally bankrupt state. That's what the book is about.
Yeah, I initially became interested in Washington Heights because I kept hearing all of these slogans and sayings about how Columbia is bettering and protecting the neighborhood because it's bringing in so many healthcare professionals and it's building this enormous medical school campus. And at the same time, I feel like the term protecting or bettering is so abused because at the end of the day, it backfires on the people that used to live there.
Right. Yeah. So that's exactly right. And I suspect, and I have to footnote this here, you know, one thing I've learned is that, you know, before you can opine about an area, you really have to study it. Now, I don't know the particular particulars in Washington Heights. And so I don't really, right? But my strong suspicion is that smart people at Columbia, they don't want to think of themselves as the gentrifiers, right? They don't want to displace, right? So they're acting with the best of intentions, and et cetera. So that's the real thing that I got at, which is there are no villains in this story. It's not a Hollywood story where you can point to some, clique of guys, and it's always guys, who are sitting in this conference room with windows on the 96th floor of someplace in Midtown, plotting how they're going to kick out people. It doesn't work like that, particularly in New York. I mean, I think they want to be good partners with the neighborhood, but with the tools that they have, what they do is facilitate displacement. All we know is that time after time after time, all over the country, this same tired story gets repeated over and over and over again. And, neighborhoods over time tend to become whiter, wealthier, at least urban neighborhoods, whiter, wealthier, better educated. And, it's not like suddenly the poor cease to be poor. They just cease to be visible. And they're somewhere else, right? They get pushed somewhere else.
Like the bypass highway.
Of course.
Yeah.
Exactly. That's exactly right.
Like you said, this happens all over the US, and it's the same cycle. What would you say is the best way to get people involved or get people to engage in a conversation about this, or in general, do something physically?
Well, so I think the most important thing is wire yourself in with the neighborhood. Right? A lot of people use the word community. I tend to use neighborhood because people are members of a lot of communities, right? But they only live in one place. And in a city, that place is called the neighborhood. And that neighborhood has expertise and wisdom and power if it's tapped, if it's allowed to grow. Those are the folks who have to own and control the assets. So the first thing it seems to me is to create a relationship with that, with the neighborhood. And that's not easy because they may or may not be organized. A lot of these folks have a lot of other concerns, right? These are folks who may be working 2 jobs, or maybe it's a single mom, right? And they got plenty of other stuff on their plate, particularly in, tough economic times that we've been in forever. So, organizing that population, folks who ought to have the real power, that's a challenge, but it's the most important challenge because their voice has to be centered, right? It's so easy to center the outsider's voice because they have independent funding and they have, et cetera. You got to resist that temptation. And then, it has to be a real, the model that I described is what I call the neighborhood trust. Community land trusts are similar, but, there are legal forms that are taking shape that do what I'm talking about, which is shift power to the right population. That is, the poor who are in the neighborhood that's at risk, and decommodify at scale property. Now, I don't know the situation in Washington Heights, whether land is still affordable. I suspect if it's anywhere within 10 blocks of Columbia, it's probably pretty pricey land. And so the idea of taking that land out of the speculative market might be an extremely expensive proposition. But that's the challenge. And, I think that the city of New York and the state of New York ought to participate in that process, make financial commitments in that regard. Why? Because, Harlem didn't happen by accident, right?
No. In your studies of Providence, was anything surprising to you considering how common gentrification has unfortunately become and everything you knew prior to beginning your research? Did any trend surprise you or?
Yeah, it did. I thought that I was going to write this hero story because Olneyville when I started studying it, it was rough. And in the time, well, it's still rough, but in the time I was studying it, this change was taking place before my eyes. And it was becoming really much, just identifiably, empirically better, safer, healthier. And I thought, wow, isn't this cool? This is going to be this great success story. And I'm going to talk about how it happened. And maybe this will be a template for other places. They can do what Olneyville did, the kind of very grassroots collaborative effort. They don't fight over dollars there. They have regular meetings of all the organizations that are involved. I mean, they have a really good relationship with the mayor. Yeah, gosh, look how cool this is. And that's where I was for a long time. And I thought that's the book I was going to write. And part of that was going to be the reform of the police department. It went from being a really bad police department to a much better police department. I was just, see, it's possible. But then I started looking at who was actually benefiting and how this change, as wonderful as it was creating a different kind of vulnerability. Mm-hmm. And so then I just sort of reconceived the book, and I said, to what the book became, which was, you've got to be kidding me. You've got to be kidding me. So that was the surprise, that even when they do everything right, in fact, because they do everything right, that's the real moral bankruptcy. Because they do everything right, what they create is a vulnerability that ends up displacing the folks who lived through the worst of it. Mm-hmm. And, residents there describe how Olneyville was rough. Olneyville was really, it was a time when, some of the highest crime rates, murder rates, not just in Providence and not just in Rhode Island, but all up and down the Northeast seaboard. People knew Olneyville. Well, it ain't that anymore. And so people lived through that. Mm-hmm. And the payout for living through that is to get kicked out.
You describe that in such a great way, how it looks all shiny and perfect and almost exemplary and heroic from the outside, but then once you started looking closer, you just couldn't write a book about
you can't tell that story. You tell that story, and you're telling a false story if you do that, because you're leaving out where people are at now. Mm-hmm. And if they don't do anything in 10 years, 15 years, Olneyville will be destroyed from what it was. It will no longer be a low-income, exciting, viable neighborhood. It won't be what it could be, and that's a tragedy.
That is definitely very upsetting. But I hope in our lifetime, I hope in my lifetime, I see that this issue gets resolved somehow, and there's better systems in place to prevent such things from happening. Yeah, well, you got to empower the right people and decommodify the land. That's the key. Yeah. And good luck with that. And that's hard in a capitalist state. It's hard. But you got to sand down the rough edges of rapacious capitalism.